The elevator is stuck somewhere between the 32nd and 33rd floor and nobody can hear the kids screaming inside because the walls are too thick and the building is too tall and the two children trapped in that small metal box are crying so hard they can barely breathe while outside in the hallway a golden retriever named Max is barking so loud and so desperately that people are starting to yell at him to stop, but he won't stop because he knows something is terribly wrong, and what happens next is the kind of thing you don't believe until you see it with your own eyes, because this dog is about to do something that no one in that building thought was possible, and by the end of this story you're going to understand exactly why some people say dogs aren't just pets, they're guardians sent to protect the ones they love. Now, to understand how we got here we need to go back about 40 minutes before all this chaos started, because this wasn't supposed to be a dangerous day. It was supposed to be a normal Tuesday afternoon in one of the most exclusive residential towers in Manhattan, and the man who owned the penthouse on the top floor was a billionaire named Richard Kensington, and yes, that's his real last name, and yes, he really was worth more than most small countries, and he had 2 kids, a 7-year-old daughter named Lily and a 5-year-old son named Ethan, and those 2 kids had everything you could imagine, from the best schools to private tutors to vacations on private islands, but the thing they loved most in the entire world wasn't any of that stuff. It was Max, their 4-year-old golden retriever who had been with the family since he was a puppy and who followed those kids everywhere like a soft golden shadow. Now Richard wasn't home that afternoon. He was across town in meetings, because that's what billionaires do, they're always in meetings, and the kids were supposed to stay upstairs with their nanny Maria, who had been with the family for 3 years and who loved those kids like they were her own. But on this particular day Maria had stepped into the laundry room down the hall to grab something, and she told the kids to stay in the living room and play with Max, and they said okay, and they meant it, but kids are curious and kids are restless, and about 2 minutes after Maria walked out, Lily looked at Ethan and said, "Let's go surprise mommy and see her bring the grocery bags," and Ethan said okay, and Max tilted his head the way dogs do when they're trying to understand, and before anyone could stop them the 2 kids slipped out the front door and walked straight to the private elevator that only served the top 5 floors. Now this elevator wasn't like regular elevators, it was sleek and modern, and it had a brass interior with soft lighting and a glass panel that showed the floors as it moved, and the kids had ridden it 100 times with their parents, so they didn't think twice about pressing the button and stepping inside. And what they didn't know was that building maintenance had flagged a minor electrical issue with that elevator earlier that morning, and they were supposed to shut it down for inspection, but the work order got delayed because someone was on break and someone else forgot to put up the sign, and so when Lily pressed the button for the lobby the doors closed and the elevator started going down, and for about 10 seconds everything seemed fine until suddenly there was a jolt and the whole box just stopped. At first the kids thought it was kind of funny because the lights flickered, and Ethan laughed and said it's like a spaceship, and Lily pressed some buttons but nothing happened, and then she pressed the emergency button and still nothing happened, and that's when the first little wave of fear started creeping in because the elevator wasn't moving and no one was answering, and the lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on all the way, they just stayed dim like the whole thing was running out of power. And Lily grabbed her little brother's hand and said it's okay, we just have to wait, and Ethan believed her because big sisters are supposed to know everything. Meanwhile, up on the top floor, Max had been sitting by the front door since the moment those kids left, and when Maria came back from the laundry room and didn't see them, she called their names and Max started whining and pawing at the door, and Maria opened it and looked down the hall and saw nothing, and her heart dropped because she knew those kids and she knew they didn't stay put, and she ran toward the elevator and pressed the button and nothing happened, and that's when she noticed the floor indicator was frozen between numbers and her whole body went cold. She pulled out her phone and called building security, and they said they'd send someone up, and she called Richard's assistant and left a frantic message, and the whole time Max was pacing and barking and running in circles like he was trying to tell her something, and Maria kept saying, "Max, calm down, not now," but Max didn't calm down because dogs don't calm down when they sense danger, they do the opposite, they escalate, and that's exactly what Max did. Inside the elevator the temperature was starting to rise because the ventilation system had shut off when the power glitched, and Lily was fanning her brother with her hand, and Ethan was starting to cry and say he couldn't breathe, and Lily was trying to be brave but her voice was shaking, and she kept pressing the buttons and banging on the walls and yelling, "Hello, is anyone there?" but no one could hear her because the elevator was stuck in that dead zone between floors where sound doesn't travel and where help feels impossibly far away. Back in the hallway, a maintenance worker finally arrived and he looked at the panel and said, "It's jammed between floors, we need to call the fire department." And Maria said, "Call them now." And he said, "I already did, they're on their way." And Maria pressed her hands against the cold metal doors and yelled, "Lily, Ethan, can you hear me?" But there was no response, and Max was going absolutely crazy at this point, barking and jumping and scratching at the elevator doors so hard his nails were leaving marks, and the maintenance worker grabbed his collar and said, "Someone get this dog out of here, he's making everything worse." But Maria hesitated because she had never seen Max act like this, and something in her gut told her this wasn't just panic, this was purpose. But the maintenance worker was insistent and he handed Max off to a building concierge who dragged him toward the stairwell, and Max fought the whole way, pulling and twisting and barking so loud it echoed through the whole floor, and people were stopping and staring, and someone said, "What's wrong with that dog?" And no one had an answer because no one was listening. And that's the thing about dogs, they try so hard to tell us things and we're so often too busy to hear them. Inside the elevator, Ethan had gone quiet and Lily was shaking him and saying, "Ethan, wake up, Ethan, please." And his little body was limp and his face was pale, and she didn't understand what was happening, but she knew it was bad, and she screamed louder than she ever had in her life. And that scream finally reached someone because a woman in the hallway heard it and said, "Oh my God, there are kids in there." And the maintenance worker said, "We know, we're working on it, but it's not that simple." And the woman said, "Well, make it simple, because that sounds like a child in serious trouble." Now here's where everything changes, because Max had been dragged to the stairwell, but the concierge made the mistake of loosening his grip for just a second to open the door, and Max twisted free and bolted, and he ran straight back to the elevator, and before anyone could stop him, he did something no one expected. He squeezed his body into the tiny gap between the elevator doors and the wall where the emergency release panel was, and he started biting and clawing at the wires and cables, and everyone was yelling and trying to pull him back, but Max wouldn't stop, and he bit through something, and suddenly there was a loud mechanical click and the elevator dropped about 6 inches and everyone screamed, but then it stopped and the doors cracked open just a sliver, and the maintenance worker shoved a pry bar into the gap and forced it open the rest of the way. The scene inside was something no one was prepared for, because Lily was sitting on the floor cradling her little brother's head in her lap, and tears were streaming down her face, and Ethan wasn't moving, and the air in that elevator was thick and hot. And the first paramedic on scene pushed past everyone and scooped Ethan up and started running toward the stairs because the elevator obviously wasn't safe, and another paramedic grabbed Lily and carried her out, and Maria was sobbing and Max collapsed right there in the hallway, his whole body shaking and his mouth bleeding from where he'd bitten through the wires. They rushed Ethan to the hospital, and on the way his vitals started stabilizing because the fresh air and the oxygen mask were doing their job, and by the time they reached the ER he was awake and crying and asking for his sister and asking for Max, and the doctors said he was going to be fine, he just overheated and hyperventilated and his little body couldn't handle the stress, but there was no permanent damage. And when Richard Kensington got the call, he left his meeting without saying a word and drove to that hospital faster than he'd ever driven anywhere in his life. When he walked into that room and saw his 2 kids sitting on the hospital bed holding hands, he broke down in a way no one had ever seen, because this was a man who built empires and negotiated billion-dollar deals and never showed weakness, but in that moment he was just a father who almost lost everything, and he held those kids so tight and he kept saying, "I'm sorry, I wasn't there, I'm so sorry." And Lily looked up at him and said, "Daddy, it wasn't your fault, Max saved us." And Richard didn't understand what she meant until Maria explained everything. She told him how Max had been trying to warn everyone from the very beginning, and how people kept pushing him away, and how he broke free and ran straight back to those doors, and how he literally chewed through the emergency cables and triggered the manual release, and how the maintenance worker said later that without Max doing that they would have had to wait another 15 to 20 minutes for the fire department to arrive with the right equipment, and in that time Ethan might not have made it. Richard sat there in silence for a long time, and then he asked, "Where's Max?" And Maria said, "He's in the lobby, the building staff has him." And Richard stood up and walked out of that hospital room and took the elevator down to the lobby, and when he saw Max lying on a blanket with a bandaged paw and dried blood around his mouth, he walked over and knelt down, and Max lifted his head and wagged his tail weakly, and Richard just sat there on the floor of that fancy lobby in his $3,000 suit. And he wrapped his arms around that dog, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and people walked by and stared, but Richard didn't care, because in that moment titles and money and status meant absolutely nothing. The only thing that mattered was this dog who had given everything to save his children. They took Max to the vet that night and he needed stitches in his mouth and his paw was sprained from all the scratching, but the vet said he would make a full recovery and Richard said whatever he needs give it to him, and for the next few weeks Max was treated like royalty even more than before, and Lily and Ethan refused to let him out of their sight, and every night they slept in the same room with Max curled up between them, and Richard would stand in the doorway and just watch because he understood now in a way he never had before that all the security systems and all the money in the world couldn't replace the instinct of a dog who simply refused to give up. The building ended up doing a full investigation and they found that the maintenance delay was caused by a series of small mistakes that added up to something almost catastrophic, and changes were made and protocols were updated, but Richard said publicly that the real hero of that day wasn't a person or a procedure, it was a 4-year-old golden retriever who listened when no one else did. And here's the thing that stays with me about this story: it's not just about a dog saving kids, it's about how often we ignore the signs right in front of us because they don't look the way we expect them to look. Because when Max was barking and running and scratching, people didn't see a hero, they saw a problem, they saw a distraction, they saw an animal out of control. But Max knew exactly what he was doing and he kept doing it even when everyone tried to stop him, and that kind of loyalty, that kind of determination, that's not something you can teach and it's not something you can buy, it's just something that exists in the bond between a dog and the people they love. So let me ask you something, and I really want you to think about this. If you were in that hallway and you saw a dog acting the way Max was acting, would you have listened or would you have assumed he was just being difficult? And if you have a dog at home and they ever act strangely, do you pay attention or do you brush it off because maybe, just maybe, they're trying to tell you something that could change everything? If this story moved you the way it moved me, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe another parent who understands what it's like to worry about their kids, or maybe a dog lover who already knows that these animals are more than pets, they're family and they're protectors, and sometimes they're the only ones paying attention when the rest of the world looks away.